Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Fagem Radian here in Washington, D.C. at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies for the launch of a new report, A Preface to Strategy, the Foundations of American National Security, a panel that included former Navy Secretary Richard Danzig, former Deputy Defense Secretary Bob Work, Avril Haines, former Deputy National Security Advisor, and Jim Miller, who was a former Pentagon policy chief. And we have two of those four chairs for this august body, Bob Work, as well as Richard Danzig, folks who have an affiliation with the Applied Physics Lab that's also part of Johns Hopkins University. And as I said, former Navy Secretary and former Deputy Defense Secretary. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Richard, let me ask you, this is, it's a very, very interesting report. You guys raise sort of a different way to think about the formulation of national security strategy. Talk to us about the imperative for taking a different model and looking at this, because you could argue that the dynamic circumstances, I think the report basically said, that success effectively breeds complacency, right? That we have a tendency of thinking that which we did is going to be what's going to work into the future. Talk to us about why it's imperative to have a different way of thinking as folks build national security strategy, which at the end is what's so important for the budget debates and everything else that we're having now.
It's not just the fact that success is seductive, which you're right about, and is an important part, but it's also that as we build success, we build institutional arrangements in our structures and our processes and in our strategic thinking that tend to continue. So, for example, the report points out that in the early years of the creation of our present establishment, the obvious domains of warfare were sea and undersea, land and air. And what we did was we created services for each of those and empowered those services. And to this day, they remain the dominant resource allocators within the Pentagon world. But we all recognize that an arena, space, which wasn't previously thought about as an arena of conflict, or the electromagnetic spectrum with cyber warfare and the like, now becomes a central arena of conflict. And in fact, it may be more central in the near term or certainly in the longer term than we've taken account of. So how do you deal with the empowerment of the people who need to deal with that? Or to take another example, how do you change your personnel system so that it rewards people who have expertise in those domains, when in fact, if you want to be chief of a service or the like, you better not be in those domains. So those are the kinds of questions we press on and come to grips with and push, and they're illustrative of why, if you understand some of the history, you can begin to understand some of our under-discussed biases or predispositions and the need to begin to change them.
Bob, why don't you talk to us a little bit about some of the recommendations you guys made, because each one of you in the presentation took two bites. Richard took the whole economic and how the competition and the dynamic is very different today. In World War II, we were in a very, very different place, for example, than we are today in terms of the democratization of technology. Issues that you worked very, very hard when you were Deputy Secretary, talking about why we've got to work a third offset strategy, for example. But talk to us in terms of what are some of the key takeaways from your standpoint in sort of recommendations that you guys make.
Well, we didn't make any specific recommendations. In fact, what we said was our general approach to strategy is to have a threat-based approach. So we worry about a rising China. We worry about a resurgent Russia. But what we said is, look, you need to step back, and this is why we call it a preface to strategy. First, we try to lay out all of the predispositions that have built up since the end of World War II. They are very powerful and still have a magnetic pull on resource allocation, on the way we organize globally with our geographic commanders. And then we point out these 8 major shifts just among them. The fact that we've been at continuous war since 2001. That automatically gives you more of an near-term focus. You're focused on readiness. You're focused on getting the next group of soldier, sailor, air, and marine out the door. But it takes your mind off what is really coming down the line in terms of space, in terms of cyber. So what we did is the fundamental recommendation we made is start from our strengths. That is the foundation for no matter what way we go. Start with our strengths. So we don't make recommendations other than the fact that, consider the strengths as the fundamental underpinning of what has made America successful and will continue to make America successful in a very competitive environment which sees conflict, cooperation, and competition.
I would just add that another theme in the paper is that coming from a national security background, we're very used to the idea that military action entails risk. And there's a huge amount of effort spent to both reduce it and address it and recognize it. We emphasize also that we ought to put more emphasis on moves towards peace, and that there are opportunities out there, for example, collaborative programs with China, a mission to Mars, working on international problems like climate change, where we have options and opportunities for peace that build cooperation. The ways in which we do that will entail risk. We ought to be very cognizant of that, but the fact that there's risk shouldn't be ultimately a reason we don't do it. There's risks on all sides of the equation.
And the example that Jim Miller gave in the presentation this morning, of course, is our outreach to North Korea. He even mentioned that most of the fellows who are national security experts are a little skeptical of where this might lead. But the risks, the potential gains far outweigh the risks in our view. To reach out to North Korea and try to reduce nuclear tensions will lead, there is a good chance it will lead to more peace on the peninsula. So those are the type of risks that we say, be sure that you take into account.
I know you guys' time is short, so I have one question for each of you, even though I've got about 10 questions I'd rather ask you. But let me ask you this, Richard. What are America's strengths? I mean, what do you assess to be those strengths to build on? Because Americans have a tendency of believing, and used to say about China, well, there's special sauce to be in an American. The Chinese will never make progress, for example. And we're finding actually the Chinese have been making tremendous progress, and other nations are making progress and gaining ground on us. So what do you think are the strengths on which the United States should use as a foundation on which to build?
Well, we enumerate 7 of them. I'll just touch on 3 given our limited time. One is definitely our values. We have an extraordinary emphasis on freedom, and that is the very core of U.S. society. Amidst all the things that divide us and the debates and so forth, the idea that government is by the people and for the people is fundamental to America, and is not fundamental to our potential adversaries, China and Russia. That gives us an evocative proposition for the world as a whole. It also should be something that we need to remember is why we care about beating back autocracy and the like. There's really something at stake here. It's no longer really a risk that China or Russia would invade the United States and take over this country. It's not that traditional historical kind of risk. It's a different kind. A second thing I'd emphasize is the technology skills and the economy of this country. We think that that's an enormous advantage that we have, our creativity, et cetera. We mentioned in the talk that America was thought of as nature's nation in the 19th century and the 18th century. It is now a technology nation, and that gives us a huge advantage. But at the same time, technology is proliferating globally. China will be a strong competitor, is already a strong competitor for us in that arena. We need to invest in that arena, in the education and the human capital of our people and the like. The last point I'd mention is our military forces. All of us have huge admiration for the quality of what we have, but we also need to recognize that it needs to develop in these new arenas in ways that are unfamiliar to it. And you can't be in the position of Kodak or other famous enterprises that did so well with what you had that you can't change now to deal with what you need to do in the future.
Do you think, though, that several people were asking the same question about the seeming disconnect between America's historic rhetoric about freedom and its values and the confusion of it, right? Hank Gaffney raised that question, I think, very eloquently for many in the room, where you have, for example, in whether it's in Wisconsin or Michigan, legislatures moving to stymie incoming governors, for example.
I think one reason we want to protect democracy in this country is because of the national security implications of failing to do it. We obviously care about it for reasons quite apart from national security. But when we degrade our ability to govern ourselves, we actually diminish our position in the world as well. And I think that's an important point to recognize. That said, this country has been through extraordinary turbulence over time. We fought a civil war. We've had periods where this kind of tumult and dissension has existed. The question is, can we be resilient and restore that? And we're emphasizing that that's an important thing, not only unto itself, but because of America's position in the world.
And let me ask you a last question. Let me ask you, Bob. You fought some of these battles internally. Everybody on that panel has said what others have said, which is a little bit counter to the National Defense Strategy Commission, which is arguing for nearly $1 trillion sustained budgets, is a reality that even if we get more money at a time when Washington is debating whether it'll be 700, 750, 733, split the difference. Good bit of negotiating perhaps on the president's part to try to get as high of a number as he can, or stick it to Democrats before they even take charge. But what are some of the trade-offs that have to be made, right? Because each one of you said just spending enough is not going to be the key here. We're also going to have to outthink the problem and to make some hard choices. Everybody talks about hard choices, but they oftentimes don't want to be specific. We heard Jim Miller get a little bit more specific about range and persistence, nuclear submarines, for example, as being important discriminators. Talk to us a little bit about the trade-offs in the intellectual thinking, given that you invested quite a lot of time with your team and continue to spend quite a lot of time trying to identify what that future needs to look like, where you take some of these risks, what do you let go that's no longer working, what do you double down on in terms of what are going to be future discriminators?
It's an extraordinarily broad question, Vago. So let me answer it this way. I was in a discussion yesterday where someone said something that I've found to be exactly right and something we need to remind ourselves. They said, look, we could execute this national defense strategy at $700 billion if we make the right choices. And we could totally mess it up at $750 billion if we make the wrong choices. And so what we are saying as part of this preface to strategy is that the first thing you have to question are all these predispositions that have built up.
That spending more just makes you safer.
Spending more makes you safer. You can outspend your opponents. As Richard pointed out in his presentation, the United States has never faced a competitor or group of competitors that have more than combined 40% of our own GDP. That has been the case since 1885, when the U.S. was confronted by Britain, not as an enemy, but as a country that had greater economic capacity and GDP than its own. So in a world in which the percentage of GDP is declining, along with all of our treaty allies, it is declining too, and we are faced with competitors like China that have enormous productive capacity and could potentially pass our own economy by 50%. This is all about making smart choices. It's not about the level of money. So when I hear people say, hey, we have to spend 4% of GDP or we have to do this, I just say, well, okay, spend 4% of GDP, but tell me what you're going to do, because we could totally mess up the strategy at 4% GDP.
Now you're giving me an extraordinary opportunity to do something I've always wanted to do, which was when I was Secretary, Bob would do this to me all the time. Mr. Secretary, you have to go.
Richard Danzig, former Navy Secretary, and his former aide who eventually became the Deputy Defense Secretary, Bob Work. Gentlemen, thank you so very much. It's always a pleasure. Look forward to having a somewhat more relaxed conversation.
Take care.
Great. Thanks.